Ladies and gentlemen, I consider it a rare privilege indeed that a videotape is made of an entirely personal nature and that I have a chance to talk to you today in the form of an informal chat about my own life. I don't do that at all in order to show you what a wonderful man I am. On the other hand, I want to stay away from any false modesty either. I consider the value of such an enterprise in the fact that I had the privilege of having a long life and a varied life. I encountered in my life a great number of eminently interesting people, excellent people, in various countries and in various situations. I had a chance to be exposed not only to excellent people and excellent situations, but to great ideas, and contribute myself to some extent to the development of great ideas. And therefore, there is quite a bit what I can say. Naturally, I would like to say things always in such a way that I put it in a broader background, because it is not my own personality which is important, but it is the interrelation between the ego, the I, and the surrounding world, which I think might be of interest. So I start out with the fact that I was born before the beginning of this century. I was born in 1893 in Hungary, in a country place, in a village, not a big village, about 30,000 inhabitants, and about 60 kilometers or 40 miles to the southwest from Budapest, a town of remarkable vigor and remarkable intellectual interest, where people lived a life which was rich in many respects, not rich in material goods, but rich in intellectual values. One probably has a wrong impression what such a small country as Hungary actually was. But in a sense, it was a gem in the line of gracious living. Gracious living in the sense that one considered it a privilege to study, a privilege to participate in intellectual endeavors, in music, in art, in science. And so it was very different from the kind of permissive society we have today. When I grew up, it was the late Victorian era, I think, by which one could characterize the Middle European scene of those days. The parents were on a very high pedestal and were highly removed from a person's actual presence. One didn't discuss any kind of intimate matters with the parents. And one had certain duties, automatically certain duties, in connection with privileges. It was not the idea what is coming to me, a certain education that is coming to me. We considered it a privilege because, after all, the educated middle class, that was already a kind of capitalistic selection, granted. But it was a selection. It was not everybody's job to be able to study. And therefore, we appreciated the fact that we could study and that it was automatically our duty to express our appreciation by working hard. In the middle, the so-called secondary school education was on a high level. It was not the question of what one learned, but one developed certain attitudes which were tremendously important because they accompanied a person throughout his life. The study was a duty and also a privilege. We found it wonderful to be exposed to all those ideas through which the human race went. And since at that time, in these pre-puberty years, one was still free of that emotional upset which came later on. These years spent in the secondary school were formative years of very great importance to a person's life. And as I told you, we had, of course, all subjects in sciences, arts, languages. It was a so-called humanistic gymnasium where Latin and Greek was taught. If one wanted, one could be free of the education in Greek, but Latin was compulsory, and I think we had it for 8 years. But it's a wonderful, wonderful background. A classical background, I think, is very important and very good. And so these years were important. They opened doors, they opened channels in so many directions. And we took advantage of that. We had discussions, and we had a club where the students themselves came together and had discussions in all kind of adventures. Some of them were interested in poetry, some of them in art, some of them in sciences. And by presenting essays and presenting talks to the rest of the students, we came already into a frame of mind where we saw how valuable discussions are, and how one should stay away from a kind of dogmatic attitude by the fact that the same issue has various aspects and that one can discuss under various aspects. I consider that a very important experience, to stay away from dogmatism and one-sidedness by seeing that the same issue has various aspects. And we were used to that from our secondary days on, secondary school year days on. Now, when I finished in 1910, made my so-called maturity examination, which was the entrance, in a sense, the entrance examination to the university. One was automatically taken then at the university. I developed actually from my about 15th year on, I had a very strong predilection toward the sciences, toward mathematics, physics, particularly mathematics. And so it was for me no question that I wanted to pursue mathematics as a profession, very much against the wish of my father, who was an eminent lawyer, a very excellent man, highly appreciated in that town, but a man of somewhat pragmatic mind who said, you have to look out in life, what are you going to do now? What can you do with mathematics? There were no industrial labs in Hungary. There were no, one couldn't count on a university career because there were so exceedingly few positions free. And so what one could do is you prepared to become a secondary school teacher of mathematics or physics. And that happened to be an occupation which didn't appeal to my father at all. However, I have been able to break down his antagonism and started at the University of Budapest in 1911 to study mathematics, physics, and as a side subject, philosophy. This philosophy course meant tremendously much to me because it was an outstanding expositor. I mean, this man, Bernard Alexander, who was an outstanding man as an expositor, as a teacher. He was a born teacher. He was not a man who did very much in the history of philosophy, or that was his subject, the history of philosophy. He wrote a few articles and a book on Spinoza and Kant. On Kant, he was a tremendous expert on Kant. But what was his strength was that he put himself completely, I mean, starting with the old Greeks and coming up to modern times. He always put himself completely identified himself completely with the philosopher whom he just happened to discuss. So that when he talked on Kant, to us it looked that everything is just wonderful. It must be that this is the philosophy. Then when he came then to Fichte, it turned out everything was wrong that Kant has done. And so his idea was what he called immanent criticism. One should criticize a system, first of all, from his own standpoint. And then one can criticize it from the standpoint of an outsider. Then one can criticize it from the standpoint of how does it fit into the general frame of philosophy. But first of all, you have to understand it from its own standpoint, how consistent it is. What can you do with it? How much does it help you to understand the great problems of philosophy? This was to me a wonderful experience. And I enjoyed his course so much that I think I took it twice, this course in the history of philosophy, because it was such a great experience. In addition to that, I took the usual courses in mathematics and physics. And it happened that one didn't go only to the university, because there was also, of course, I spent these years in Budapest. I got away from home, and I spent these 4 or 5 years until ending, because it was not only the 4 years university course, you had to finish also, you have to take the so-called pedagogical or educational courses in order to be privileged, in order to get the license for teaching. So it was approximately 5 years before you really finished. And because you had to have also the courses in the history of in educational matters, and you had to have also some practice teaching and so on. Now, I was, of course, lucky, because I did make a university career from the beginning, and my father was more than happy and more than satisfied when he saw that I didn't have to go to a secondary school for the rest of my life. And I graduated then approximately in 1915, 16. I started to work on my research problems. I wanted to make the PhD, but I got an appointment as an assistant at the Polytechnicum. As I told you, the university was not the only place. One also went to the technical engineering school, this Polytechnicum, which was also an institution of very high standing, and took certain courses in mathematics, physics, there. So that I was acquainted with the staff of both of these institutions. And there was, when I graduated, after my graduation, I got an appointment to become an assistant of physics in the Polytechnicum. I spent there 4 years, from 1916 to 20. These were bad years, in a certain sense, because Hungary was unfortunately the first country in Europe where the ugly head of anti-Semitism raised itself already during the war and particularly after the war. The propaganda was that the Jews did not do enough, that not enough Jews died in the war, that they were in privileged positions, and therefore they tried to dodge the military service. Personally, I was not taken to military service on account of my physical makeup, which was considered unsuited for military service. But the actual statistics shows that this is absolutely untrue. The Jews died like anybody else, at least in the proportion of the population, so that there was absolutely no truth in the allegation that they were not patriotic, they were not sufficiently patriotic, and that they wanted to dodge the war issue. But it started already during the war. And after the war, there was a very unfortunate episode. For half a year, Hungary was under a communistic, Béla Kun, a communistic Soviet type of government, in which unfortunately there were certain Jews in the government. Now the revenge was terrible. It came a kind of, in the form of a white terror, so-called white terror, which was just as bad as a Nazi terror. Only it didn't last very long, because the Hungarian people are not very subject to prolonged hatreds. And although you can certainly, by propaganda, you can get them to do anything, but it doesn't hold out for very long. So this extreme fascistic or Nazistic type of hate propaganda, in which thousands of Jews died, and one had to watch out for a person for one's life, did not last very long, for about half a year. However, when I personally had absolutely no difficulties, never. I got along very well with the staff, I got along with the students very well, I had no personal difficulties. Everybody knew that I'm a Jew, and I was never hiding that, and there was no difficulty. And when these 4 years were over, then my boss told me that, I'm sorry, but I am not in the position to renew you know what the conditions are, I cannot renew your contract. So I resigned in 1920 and prepared for my PhD. I got my PhD at the University of Szeged, which was a country university in Budapest, away from Budapest. I got it there from a professor with whom I was on very good terms. He was not a very productive mind, but exceedingly good-hearted and exceedingly taking the issue of the young physicists. He did a great deal for Hungarian physics. And I made me a PhD degree with him in physics as a major subject, mathematics as a second major subject, philosophy as a minor subject. So that brings me now to the year of 1921. On account of the so-called Jewish law, there was no, which restricted of course, we must not forget the Jews did play a very prominent role in the professionals, in the professions, in the lawyers, the doctors, the journalists were more than 50% in Budapest of the Jewish extraction. So that there was a certain, that this must have caused a certain jealousy that was obvious. Then came the Jewish law, which restricted all these activities to the percentage of the population, which was only 7%. Which meant that the Jews were practically cut off of the higher studies, because they were not taken at the university anymore. This had, in a certain sense, very beneficial effects, because there was a phase difference. The anti-Semitism in Hungary started around 1920, around these years. In Germany, the same movement started 33, but there were these 13 years between. So some outstanding Hungarians, as for example, Wigner and Johnny von Neumann, Teller, Szilard, quite a number of outstanding physicists who left the country because they were forced to leave the country, went to Germany. And in those days, you could study in Germany, and you were fully accepted. And these exceptionally gifted people came into positions which corresponded to their gifts, and they had a chance to do their graduate studies there and come into the proper positions. When Hitler came, these people were already so famous and they were already so well established in their sciences that the United States recognized the importance of getting such outstanding people, and they immediately got a position in the United States. So it worked out, this phase difference between the anti-Semitic excesses in Hungary and later in Germany worked out exceedingly well for the intellectual elite, that there were many victims undoubtedly, but as far as the intellectual elite goes, it worked out very well. And these people came to Germany then, and from Germany they came to the United States. To some extent to England, but to a large extent to the United States. And I personally, in 21, after making my PhD degree, I made an application to a German university, and I was taken immediately, because to my surprise, the fact that I was a Jew didn't play any role. But after all, I was a foreigner from Hungary. And some of these German universities were pretty much nationalistically minded. But it was the deepest inflation in Germany. Germany was in the clutches of the inflation. When the mark went into the millions and billions and lost all value. At that time, anybody who amounted to something, any physicist or engineer, or basically also the scientifically trained people, worked for industry, because there they were paid in dollars, they were paid in hard currency, and so they were not lost. And the university positions were free. They advertised to get people. I got immediately a position in Freiburg im Breisgau. I enjoyed it tremendously. I made very good contacts with my boss, who was a German nationalist of the old school, very conservative in his outlook, but a charming man, and we got along very well. He became 70 years at that time, and a successor brought his assistants along, so I had to look out for something else. I got immediately another position in Frankfurt am Main. That was in 1924. I went to Frankfurt. I stayed there for 7 years, up to 31. And I published already at that time. I started to publish in the field of relativity, which attracted me tremendously. It was something of a tremendous experience to come in touch with the Einsteinian ideas, which at first as a young undergraduate student I rejected as absurd, as so many other people do. But when I really understood what he wants to do and what these ideas are, that was like a champagne. I mean, that was something tremendously exciting. And I started to work. I started to publish already. My first publication came out in 1922. And I had a number of publications in connection with the Einsteinian gravitational theory. And it so happened that Einstein, in the year of around 1927, he had an assistant who, Grommer, who for some reasons had to leave. And he was looking for somebody. And Szilard, who worked with him at that time, he was influential. He knew my papers to suggest me as his assistant. Thus it happened that in 1928-29, I got a leave of absence from the University of Frankfurt to work in Berlin. Now this year was a tremendous year, because to see such a great man almost daily and have a chance to talk to him about mutually interesting problems in physics was, of course, an enormous experience. I came in touch with many other great men too, so-called great men, but here was a man who was really great, not in the conventional sense, but in the true sense of the word. And so this year meant terrifically much to me. At that time, he was already branching out in a new direction called distant parallelism, with which I somehow could not reconcile myself. I didn't think that the solution was in that direction. Einstein himself gave up after a few years. He gave up the whole trend and started something new. But on account of the fact that we couldn't see eye to eye in this question, I worked on him in a different problem, connected with his original gravitational theory, which I finished in that year and later published it in 31. So became to a friendly departure. I mean, it was over. It was over, but I came in very friendly personal relations with Einstein, and I visited him again and again later on, when he went to the States, and I was also in the States. We corresponded. We had a rather lively correspondence. And whenever I had a chance to see him in Princeton, I made it to a point to visit him there. It was basically a lifelong friendship. So I came I went back to Frankfurt, 29, and I was there up to 31. In 1931, the military or the nationalistic agitation was already very strong in Germany and very unpleasant. Again, personally, I had no bad experiences, but it was a very unpleasant feeling. What's going to happen? At that time, again, I had if I would be inclined to superstition, I would say I had an archangel who was always protecting me. So when the Hungarian anti-Semitism started, I came to Germany. When the German anti-Semitism started, I came to the United States ahead of the issue, because it was in 31, 1.5 years before Hitler came to power, when I got a call to come to Purdue University, where the head of the department, who came originally from Vienna and who read the German publications, was familiar with my publications. And he invited me to come as a visiting professor for 1 year. I accepted that position, and I was very happy because I felt that this is the chance of a lifetime. I came over to the States with practically no English. I was never interested in learning English. I didn't take English as a modern language in school. I had practically, after getting that invitation, I started to learn frantically some English phrases, but it was terribly little what I knew. However, I had the great luck that I made good contacts with the faculty, and I had one particular friend on the faculty who was sitting in my lectures, because I had to give lectures from the very beginning to a kind of faculty audience, who watched all the time, made notes, and at the end of every lecture pointed out the mistakes I made in the pronunciation and the wrong way of constructing sentences. So I learned tremendously in that year. I might say that this first year in the States was practically only used up with learning the English, because to me it was a question of existence, of survival, that I had to learn the English. And it's amazing if I look back to this first year that at the same time I published a paper which to my feeling, was of considerable interest and importance in connection with the Einsteinian theory. So I had time still to do research. But I slept very little because I was always in a very excited state. And in approximately 1 year, I had the experience that even without any particularly great gift for languages, but if you are in a country where you are forced to use a language of the country all the time, and I definitely avoided to speak either German or Hungarian with anybody. I made it to a point all the time to use English, and from the very beginning trying to think in English, which after a while I succeeded. And then gradually the vocabulary extends, and you come to the point where you can, first of all, understand what the people say. Then to the point where you can read books. Then to the point where you can read newspapers, because to read an American newspaper is much more than just reading an English book. They have their own slang. And so when you are already able to read the newspaper, then you are already rather advanced. And finally, to telephone. I mean, if you can telephone in a language, then you are at home in that language, because then you notice what a tremendously distorting device a telephone is. You have to be quite at home in a language before you are able to telephone in that language, before you are able to understand a fluent conversation in that language. So at the end of 1 year, I was at home in English, practically at home. I knew a great deal. I could express myself fluently. I could give lectures fluently. I would like to say that my success as a lecturer depended very much on the fact that I always prepared my lectures exceedingly carefully. Although I was able to talk freely after the first 2 months, that I didn't have to read the manuscript, but I spent 5 to 6 hours for every lecture that I gave at the university on a graduate level. They intentionally didn't give me any undergraduate students, because they, of course, would complain immediately for the foreign accent and so on. They were treating me exceedingly well. I made very good contact with the head of the department, its mathematics department, who was not a creative scientist in any way, but a charming man. And so this year, in a Middle Western university, meant a great deal. The Middle West is a conservative part of the States, very conservative outlook. In a certain sense, we might say narrow-minded, but in another respect, tremendously good-hearted, tremendously warm-hearted, and tremendously tolerant. And at that time, there was a great deal of interest in somebody who came from a foreign country and could tell people things, how they were in Europe, in a completely different world. They were very much interested in that. I got invitations almost from the very beginning, and I was taken full size into their academic life. So this was a wonderful experience. After 1 year, I made already good contacts, and I got, it's true, it was the depression. It was a depression in the United States. They couldn't give me a full position. They gave me a half-a-year position, because I thought I wouldn't like to give up my connections with Germany. Perhaps I could do it half a year in the States, half a year in Germany. Now this was a pipe dream, because in the meantime Hitler came to power and it didn't work out. But my father was fairly well-to-do. He could stand it that I would stay at home for half a year with my parents. And then this is what I have done from 1933 on, when Hitler came to power, and then up to 38. 38, it was after Munich. No, I think I still came home in 39, just before the war broke out, just before the World War broke out. It was the last time in Europe. And I actually succeeded in leaving with the last steamer that left Cherbourg to the United States. It was perhaps a question of life or death. At that time, I was able to save also the life of my son. He was at that time a young boy of 7, whom I took along. And after that, I got a full appointment. When after 38 or 39, I had a full appointment at Purdue University in the mathematics department. I was lecturing mostly to physicists, because it was this professor of physics who brought me over but I was appointed in the Department of Mathematics. And I gave a course in the variational principles of mechanics, which became one of my favored topics, favored subjects, on which I wrote a book which was a great success, and it is still used a great deal. It is now in the 4th edition, came out in '49 for the first time, and the last edition came out only a year ago, and the 4th edition. And I learned a great deal myself, and the remarkable fact about this lecture course was that whereas usually the remarkably ingenious methods of Hamilton, the famous Irish mathematician, were only treated as a kind of appendix at the end of the semester, a one-semester course. I had 2 semesters at my disposal. And I realized the tremendous importance of Hamiltonian methods, so that I had a full semester to develop Hamiltonian dynamics. And that again was of very great importance for my later scientific development, that I was completely at home in the Hamiltonian methods. Now, that brings me up now to the time of Purdue University and the end of the Purdue University, which was in '46. Actually, in 1938, I made a discovery, not in the line of relativity, which was my basic field, but it so happened that I had to give a course. It's amazing how much a person learns by giving a course. A German colleague of mine, an old professor of physics, made once a very witty remark. He was altogether a very witty man in Freiburg, that you see 3 times that you don't understand anything of the subject. The first time when you learn it as a student. The second time when you give a lecture course in it, in the subject. And the third time when you write a book on that. So you notice 3 times that you don't understand anything of a subject. It's a very good remark. So I learned a great deal from a lecture course, which I had to give to the students of the physics department on approximation methods. It was considered important that they should learn about approximations, and I got interested in that. And that was the reason that I have drifted into the field of approximation methods and into a field which one today calls numerical analysis. To the extent in 1938 I made a very fundamental discovery in that line, which was exceedingly useful for computational purposes. A kind of telescoping procedure where a very long stretch of terms could be telescoped into a small number of terms so that you could gain tremendously in computational time. I was not interested in how much time you gain, but I was interested in the analytical aspects, how interesting it is that you can, certain procedures exist which can obtain a certain approximation of a certain accuracy in a few steps, where before you needed a tremendously large number of steps. I was interested in the analytical aspects, but it so happened that when the big electronic machines came, and when during the war it became important to work on certain highly complex military problems, these methods were exceedingly practical. And I got a call to the National Bureau of Standards to work there as a consultant. That was in the year 43-44. I have just had a leave of absence from Purdue University. And then in '46, a previous student of mine who became the head of research, the head of the physical research at the Boeing Airplane Company, and he knew of my lectures because he himself took those lectures, and of my interest and of my knowledge and expert knowledge in the field of computations and approximation theory. He invited me to join the Boeing Airplane Company as a member of the so-called physical research unit. I had the principle in my life always to say yes, because I thought it was always interesting. Perhaps it's a kind of nomad character, maybe there's a kind of gypsy blood in me, I don't know, but I like changes. I like to change the scenery. I like to learn new things and to be confronted with new situations. Whenever somebody says, wouldn't you like to come to my place and school? I said always yes. So in 1946, I resigned from Purdue University and went to the Boeing Airplane Company in Seattle, where I worked for 3 years in this physical research unit. It was an exceedingly interesting time. I came in touch with highly educated engineers. They were excellent engineers, but they didn't understand the formal aspects of mathematics. And my problem was to translate a problem from its physical aspects into its mathematical aspects in the form that an engineer could understand it. It was a kind of reinterpretation, or just like an interpreter, to take a physical situation, translate it into engineering terms, and then to take the engineering situation, apply the principles of mathematics, get the solution, and going back again to the physical situation. In this I was successful, and I liked these contacts with these highly trained and excellent and highly intelligent engineers. They were exceedingly narrow-minded in certain respects. They had absolutely no feeling for labor problems. They always lined up with the capitalists, and absolutely no feeling that there are poor people and that they also have certain rights to live. It was quite astonishing how narrow their social outlook was. But in their own field, they were excellent. And then in 49, again, I got a call to the newly, at that time I had publications already, in particular this 38 paper with so-called Chebyshev polynomials, which I showed are exceedingly useful in numerical analysis. I got a call to the newly founded Institute for Numerical Analysis in Los Angeles. Again, I accepted it immediately, and I had 4 years, 3 or 4 years of very interesting and wonderful years in California. That was in 49 up to 53. In 53, again an unpleasant upheaval happened on account of the so-called McCarthy era, where everybody who had some liberal leanings, anybody with liberal leanings was immediately called a communist. Now, the institute for which I worked blew up automatically. It was under the sponsorship of the National Bureau of Standards, and for some reasons, this National Bureau of Standards was immediately attacked by the McCarthyites as a hotbed of homosexuals and communists. So what these two things have to do with each other is a mystery to me, but that is what they claimed. So my chief immediately lost his position, and the institute came into a very precarious position. At that time, by accident, I came in correspondence with the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies. This Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies Schrödinger was there, the famous physicist, was the director of that institute at that time. And it so happened that somebody who was an expert in editing the papers of Hamilton, the scientific papers of Hamilton, died. And he thought that perhaps since I worked so much in Hamiltonian dynamics, perhaps I would be the right person to take over his job in editing the Hamiltonian papers, which have been published by the Royal Irish Academy. So I accepted that. I got a leave of absence from the National Bureau of Standards and left for Ireland. Now, Ireland, with its old world atmosphere, appealed to me tremendously. It was an entirely new world, but it was somehow like a world to which I came back. And I liked it very much. And I came in good relations with the staff of the institute. After 1 year of visiting professorship, I did come back to the States for half a year and worked for the North American Aviation Corporation in some problems of aerodynamics and numerical analysis. But then President de Valera, who at that time was not president, but he was minister, the prime minister, he he offered me a position, a permanent position, a senior position at the Institute for Advanced Studies. This to me was of very great, not only a great honor, but it was also of great practical advantage. I was already 60 years old. In the States, I would have had to resign. In about 5 years, I would have to go into retirement. Because 65 is a retirement age. Moreover, I worked for industry for a number of years. Whereas it's very easy to go from the academic life into industry, it's not so easy to go back from industry into academic life. And I wanted to, I had a great longing to go back again, to give up these applied problems and numerical problems and computational problems. And these applications of engineering, mathematics to engineering problems and explaining to engineers what they have to do, I thought it is enough. And I wanted to go back to more fundamental problems again. I had a great longing to return to my first love, which was relativity, and to do again research in that line. So this offer came to me like a real salvation, because at our institute in Dublin, one can work up to 75, which is unusual. So I still had 15 years of active academic life. Moreover, our institute in Dublin is organized along remarkably liberal lines. It is a pure research institute. We don't have to give courses. We don't have undergraduates. We have only postdoctoral we have only postdoctoral students, as we call them scholars, who work at the institute under very free conditions. They can line up with usually line up with one of the senior professors, work under him, and then they leave after 1 or maximum 2 years. We don't grant any degrees. They are mostly students who have already their PhD degree. We make only exception with Irish students because they have so little chances to make their PhD, so they can work on a certain research subject which they can later on submit as a PhD. But otherwise, we are free of anything with which one usually is bothered in a university industry. But here, we have, it's a purely scientific institution. And I think it is remarkable that a small country like Ireland can allow itself such a luxury. That was President de Valera's great interest in mathematics. He himself was a mathematician who went into politics. And so he organized this institute along exceedingly pleasant lines, and I never regretted the fact that I went to Ireland. I thought when I finish with Ireland, maybe I can go back to the States, and I was in the States many times for visits, but then my health broke down and I could not realize these plans. And now that brings me to the present day. I'm fortunately still alive, and I continue my work as before. I have my room in the institute, and I don't see any particular change from a senior professor to emeritus professor. I don't see any particular change. I'm on very good terms with the director and with everybody else, and enjoy the fact that I can still work. And now I am here in Manchester, and I got a call, I got an invitation from Professor Hopkins and Dr. Butler, which I enjoyed tremendously, to give 6 lectures on Einstein. I gave already 6 lectures on the basis of a book that I wrote in, no, actually that book was based on these 6 lectures which I gave in Ann Arbor University. I don't repeat these lectures. In fact, I didn't look even into the book because I want to show some other aspects of the problems. But I have a chance to talk on Einstein on 6 occasions. And now this time I had a chance to talk about myself. But I think you noticed that I didn't want just to point out how many wonderful things I have done in life. But perhaps it was more interesting to give the survey of a scientific career which brought me into many countries and into many situations, interesting situations. I had a rich and interesting life, which I always appreciated tremendously. And now I am here, and you had the kindness to take this videotape of my life. So I thank you very much for your interest and for your patience.